His was the only boat to arrive.
I think maybe it was a cow. I don't know.
There's the thank you letter from Lyndon Johnson.
There was even a monorail at one point to the east of us.
Plus, everybody forgets about pirates.
This is the coolest field trip I have ever been on.
I don't know, but I've been told, keep on dancing, won't ever get old.
Hello and welcome to the Long Island History Project, the podcast that brings you stories and interviews with people passionate about Long Island history. You can hear them all at longislandhistoryproject.org. My name is Chris Kretz. I am your host, and our opening music is courtesy of the Homegrown String Band. We are back from a somewhat unintended hiatus. A lot of great interviews coming down the pike. Today we are actually revisiting an important aspect of Long Island's history, talking about a new book and some new research from today's very special returning guest.
My name is Brad Kolodny, and I am the author of the new book, The Jews of Long Island, 1705 to 1918.
And Brad, first we'll say welcome back. I was listening to our past interview, and it was during COVID. So just on a purely personal note, how are you doing? Have things changed for you since, what was it, about 2 years ago?
You know what? As far as my work goes, I've been working from home. I still have not gone back to the office, and that has given me additional time to work on what we're here to talk about, which is my second book. I had no thoughts that I would ever write a second book, and just given the fact that I had a lot of extra time on my hands from not commuting to the city every day, I decided to jump in and do some research on Jewish individuals who moved to Long Island in the late 1700s, early 1800s, 19th, 20th century. And it all came together in a book that was published by SUNY Press.
That's great. As a silver lining to all that time, it's great that you could maximize that. And we are recording, by the time this posts, the book should be out. Is that safe to say?
Yeah, the release date is March 1st.
Okay, great. And the one thing that jumped out at me were the very precise years bracketing your book. So do you want to explain, maybe to start off, why 1705 to 1918?
Sure. You know, the first thing that I wanted to make sure I could do was tell a comprehensive story about Judaism on Long Island, how it began and how it evolved during its infancy. So starting with the year 1705, that is when the first recorded Jewish man moved to Long Island, and his name was Nathan Simpson. He was a shopkeeper in the town of Brookhaven. And he didn't end up staying very long. He actually went back to Manhattan. He was a merchant, but he is the first person on record to live in either Nassau or Suffolk County, and that was in 1705. I covered the period up until 1918 pretty deliberately, because after 1918 was when the population growth on Long Island began. I think most people know about the massive growth in population following World War II, but there was also a burst after World War I. So I think telling the story of really before any significant growth happened, tells an interesting story. And it's also, something that has not been covered in any great detail before. So telling stories of people from the past that, nobody's really alive anymore to tell these stories. So I was, just thrilled to be able to bring it to light and bring this new information forward for everyone to enjoy.
That's great. So if we go back to, it was Nathan, you said, the 1705?
Nathan Simpson, Simson.
So just to use him as an example, but to ask a bigger question about the research, just to be blunt about it, how can you prove, or what did you use to verify that these were Jewish individuals you were finding?
Yeah, so the very early days, and I would say pretty much everything up until, the Revolutionary War period, was based on educational resources that scholars had already discovered and written about, not necessarily in a book form, but, in articles that had appeared in important journals and periodicals and whatnot. And then there were also, some newspaper stories, believe it or not, about Jewish individuals moving out east even in the 1750s. There were a couple of Jews that moved out to both Southampton and East Hampton. And there are other books that have been written that are about personal letters there were a couple of families that lived in New York City, but had owned property in Oyster Bay. And so through personal letters from these individuals, also gave me another source of information. And once we get into the late 19th century, early 20th century, I was able to utilize public records, census records, naturalization papers, birth, marriage, and death certificates, newspaper articles, etc. When you look at, if you've done any research in the 1910 census, the 1920 census, they don't ask religion, but they do ask, what is your mother tongue? And so the response given in a lot of cases was either Hebrew, Jewish, or Yiddish. And so we know that people who spoke Yiddish were Jewish, and certainly Hebrew and Jewish as well. So that was the main force. But, there were other methods. There were, lists of when synagogues were incorporated. Part of the incorporation process was to file an application with the Suffolk County or the Nassau County Clerk's Office. And part of the application was to list the members of the organization of that company or of that organization. And so in a lot of cases, that was a great source of getting names. And then you could look up that name in a census and you could find children of those people and brothers and sisters and other relatives. So a lot of different sources were used, but in all cases, it was very important for me to absolutely verify with 100% certainty that these people were Jewish and they lived on Long Island before the end of World War I. And I will say that this book could not have been written 25 years ago. It would just be too difficult and too time-consuming to track down all the information without the use of the internet.
Yeah, no, it is amazing. I've done research and similarly looking for needles in haystacks and things like that. And it is amazing putting the time in and dedicating yourself to it. You can pull together a lot of disparate sources and things. So what struck you about the earliest people in terms of what you could tell by the way they lived or maybe how they were perceived by their communities? And did you draw any conclusions about the earliest Jewish people you found on the island?
Sure. Yeah. I think the first theme or the first common thread about the earliest Jews that came is that most of them were peddlers. They were sort of moving from town to town, selling goods, and, without necessarily a real home base or an opportunity to establish a community because they were always on the move and reaching their customers wherever their customers lived. That can be said about the period of, let's say, 1870 through the early 1900s, but you had some peddlers that progressed at a pace that was surpassing others where they could then, graduate, let's say, to having a horse and wagon. Initially, peddlers literally just walked the entire South Shore or the North Shore along the main roads selling their goods. But once they were able to earn enough money to move up the ladder, so to speak, they would have a horse and wagon that would enable them to cover more territory and carry more goods, things that they can sell that didn't have to be carried on their back. And then I guess the third phase for merchants would be to establish their own store and to have a home base in a particular town. And, by doing so, they contributed not only to, speeding the growth of Judaism on Long Island by bringing out family or friends, but they also contributed significantly to the prosperity of the community in general. And it was very important for them to be accepted by their non-Jewish neighbors. And, for the most part, they were, because they were contributing to the economy, making things available, whether they came as a merchant, as I described, but also there were tailors and shoemakers and butchers and farmers even. The people who came out to a very lightly populated area and contributed to the growth of the local economy.
In our first interview, we were talking about synagogues more, but you mentioned the synagogue in Newport around. I'm just thinking back to the Jewish populations in this early time in America, which is fascinating to me. So what you mentioned a little bit about their reception in the communities. But what did you glean, or what was your sense that you got of what the wider community's feeling was about the Jewish population? Did you pick up on any vibes, or just the way they were written about at the time?
Yeah, I mean, listen, you don't have to look very hard to find, episodes of anti-Semitism. There were certainly plenty of established clubs and groups, country clubs, yacht clubs, where Jews were not allowed. And this existed up until really the, 1950s even. But in terms of the population, the Jews were certainly making up only a very small percentage of the population, whether it be on Long Island or really in the United States. I mean, as of 1880, there were only 250,000 Jews in the United States. And the reason I mention 1880 as like the benchmark is because after 1880 was when you had a significant influx of immigrants, Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe. There were 2 million Jews who came to the United States from Eastern Europe between the years of 1880 and 1920. And so that's when you started to, see some Jewish families moving out east. The Lower East Side in New York City was a crowded place, maybe a difficult place for some to earn a living. And, for some, they just didn't enjoy the urban environment and, wanted to live out in the countryside, maybe as they did when they were in their homeland, living in, what's called the shtetls of Eastern Europe. Living on Long Island gave them that opportunity to live out in the countryside in smaller communities and helping to make them grow.
If you look at the map over the 18th, 19th century, did they gravitate to, like, once there were a few established families, did they attract other families, or what kind of pattern did you see in the development as?
Yeah, absolutely. There were Jews that lived in 16 different communities on Long Island in 1880. Everything from Glen Cove to Greenport on the North Fork, and from Hempstead to Sag Harbor on the South Fork. And there was only one Jewish community that had been established prior to 1880, and that was in Breslau, which is now, as you may know, is known as Lindenhurst. And the first Jewish community was established in 1875, and that was established by only 10 men. So we're still not talking about any big numbers in any one community, okay? But what happens after 1880 is the establishment of certain factories that draw Jewish immigrants to go and work there. And you had three pretty big examples in the late 19th century. You had the watch case factory in Sag Harbor. You had a rubber factory in Setauket. And there was a lace factory in Patchogue. Now, from what I've read, and the sources say that the owners of these factories needed both skilled and manual labor. And where did they find people who are looking for these kinds of jobs? They literally went to Ellis Island and promised them a regular wage, and in some cases, even company housing for themselves and for their families. So these factories that brought out new Jewish immigrants to Setauket, to Sag Harbor, and to Patchogue, those were where the first synagogues were established and built on Long Island. The first one built in Setauket in 1896, the first synagogue itself. And then in 1900, the synagogue in Sag Harbor. You also had a synagogue in Greenport around 1903, and Patchogue was in 1904. So those were the earliest established Jewish communities on Long Island, and they were all built around industry and around places where Jewish men could go to earn a living.
In terms of the individuals, the people that you found, the personalities, who stood out to you, no matter what time, pick a time frame, but who are some of your favorite discoveries from the book?
There are many. Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of people think of Jewish immigrants as poor and, looking to earn a living and make a better life for their families and for the next generation. But, during this period, you actually had some wealthy merchants living on Long Island. If you want to take it all the way to the extreme, the Guggenheims had summer estates in Sands Point. And Benjamin Stern, who was one of the founders of the Stearns department store, he lived in Roslyn Harbor. So you did have some very, very wealthy Jewish families. And then, of course, at the other end of the spectrum, there was no shortage of people who were just looking to get by and earn a living. But I will tell you I can give you a few examples, but the one person that I found that was the most interesting to me, his name was Leo Fischel. Now, Leo Fischel was born in Babylon in 1877. And what makes Leo Fischel interesting is that he was the first Jewish pitcher in the history of Major League Baseball. So Leo, I think for me, dispels a lot of stereotypes about Jews, that they really didn't live on Long Island until after World War II. I think that's a big misconception. And that they, were not particularly athletic. Leo Fischel played for the hometown Babylon baseball team as early as 1895. He attended Columbia University, and in 1899, he pitched one game for the New York Giants, and that was it. He pitched one game and chose not to pursue a life in baseball, but he certainly made history that day, and it makes him, for me, as a big baseball fan, a standout individual of somebody who was Jewish on Long Island during this period. There are examples of entertainers who lived in Freeport. You had the vaudeville team of Eva and Harry Puck. They had a song and dance routine called Two Little Pucks, and Eva went on to success on Broadway. She was in the original cast of Showboat. Her brother Harry went on to become a composer and a songwriter. And there is a great story that I can tell about a Jewish individual who I can't say lived on Long Island, but was stationed on Long Island. And I'm talking about Irving Berlin. Irving Berlin was a Jewish immigrant. He lived in New York City, but served the United States during World War I. He never saw any active duty, but he was stationed at Camp Upton in Yaphank. And while he was stationed there, the Army utilized his best talent. And he composed a musical that helped raise money for Camp Upton. He wrote a show named after the town where Camp Upton was located. The show was called Yip Yip Yaphank. Kind of a funny name, but I guess it goes with the good-natured humor of the show in that, it was sort of like a musical review. It wasn't a drama and it didn't have a theme. It was just multiple songs where the soldiers performed all the numbers, both singing and dancing. Some of the men dressed up like women. So it was a very lighthearted show. And it actually made its way to Broadway. The most interesting part of this story about Irving Berlin is that he wrote the finale for that show, Yip Yip Yaphank, and the name of the song was God Bless America. Now, as Berlin is putting the finishing touches on the show, he realizes that God Bless America is this very serious patriotic song, which doesn't necessarily fit with the humor and light-natured show that is Yip Yip Yaphank. So he takes God Bless America, he sticks it in a trunk, and it doesn't see the light of day until the lead up to World War II, when he gives the song to Kate Smith, and it becomes what we all know today as somewhat of an unofficial anthem, written by a Jewish immigrant while on Long Island.
That's amazing. And one other thing I noticed that you, another endeavor that you took since last we spoke was the founding of a historical society.
Absolutely correct. I'm happy to talk about the Jewish Historical Society of Long Island.
And just as an aside, one of my other hats is I'm the current president of the Long Island Radio and Television Historical Society. And I know it's a tough row to hoe in terms of getting societies active, getting members. So what prompted you to found it, and what's your hope for that society?
So I established the Jewish Historical Society of Long Island in June of 2021, based primarily on the research that I had done for these two books. And, I had compiled so much information, but also photographs and personal histories and even objects that people were willing to share with me and show me and even give to me that tell the story about Judaism on Long Island. So the idea of the Jewish Historical Society is to kind of take it to another level, to where people can interact with, Jewish history more than just reading a book. We've done a number of great things so far. We have erected a historic marker in front of that first synagogue in Setauket that I spoke about. The building was built in 1896, and this past September was the 125th anniversary of the opening of the building. And so we erected a historical marker on the site where that building still stands. And we've also been active on social media, just trying to let people know about the organization and, drum up interest through a Facebook group called Long Island Jewish History. There's a lot of things that can be done. There are a lot of items that we already have in our collection, some of that which can be viewed on our website, which is jhsli.org. And people can also sign up on the website to be on our mailing list. And, who knows what the future holds. We've been really busy in the first 8 to 10 months of the organization. And, like I said, it's really just the beginning. There's a lot of things to do, a lot of recognition that can be brought to Jewish buildings, Jewish institutions, Jewish individuals, Jewish businesses that have existed in Nassau and Suffolk counties.
No, that's great, and congratulations. And I've always, not always felt, but it's an interesting challenge when you try, Long Island is such a, I don't want to say divided, but segmented. Everyone has their niche, or there's such small municipalities and things. It's hard to do something overarching, like to look at a topic, or like you're doing a population across the whole island. But it's also necessary. So it's great that you're doing it too.
I would say that the Suffolk County History Museum does a fantastic job covering the history of life in Suffolk County. So I think that you're right. I think that as far as historical societies go, they're usually focused on a certain village or town. Our historical society is the first one that I know of on Long Island that is actually religion-based.
And in terms of collections and artifacts and things, either from the society or the book, so what are some of the uniquely Jewish or pertaining to the people you were studying? What items and artifacts did you find most compelling?
Well, we have a lot of different things. I mean, from documents to photographs, but, I think the more tactile items that you'd love to hold in your hand, there are religious artifacts that were used at certain synagogues, but also people that I've met and donations that we have received. I'll give one good example. There's a gentleman who lives in South Haven. His name is Ron Bush, and his grandfather was a Jewish farmer in Holtzville starting in 1908. And Ron is dedicated to historic preservation of farming on Long Island. And he has his own personal museum with about 6 different buildings with all kinds of tools and implements and anything that you would need on a farm, tractors and knives and all kinds of things. And he was kind enough to donate a few items from both his grandfather's farm in Holtzville and his uncle's farm in East Hampton. His uncle ran a dairy farm from the 1930s to the 1970s. So he was, very generous to donate a milk can that was used, and a saw and a pitchfork and a few other items. So to have those personal items that were used by Jewish businesses in the earliest days, I think will help tell the story. And, we hope to have these items to be put on display in a museum setting. And I think we'll probably save that until we have some more concrete details for, maybe another podcast down the road.
Yeah, sure. So in terms of, again, going back to like where they settled, you mentioned, I guess, the synagogues in Sag Harbor and Setauket, and this might go beyond your cutoff date, but has the population shifted in terms of where they are living now, or for whatever reason they have gravitated to different parts of the island over time?
Oh, without question. Yeah. And we could certainly spend a whole lot of time talking about post-World War I, post-World War II, but just for the sake of being consistent with the dates of
Sure.
the book, I can tell you that most of the early Jews did move out to Suffolk County. I guess probably because of those factories and because of other opportunities that were available on the East End, inexpensive land and places to live. But after 1910, you started to see a shift with more Jews and more people in general living in Western Nassau County. Now, why 1910? Before 1910, if you wanted to go from Long Island to Manhattan, you would take the Long Island Railroad to Long Island City, get off the train, board a ferry, take the ferry to the 34th Street Terminal on the east side of Manhattan, and that got you into Manhattan. In 1910, the East River Tunnel opened. And so you then had people who actually started as the earliest commuters into New York City. And there were a number of individuals that lived, particularly on the South Shore, in places like Cedarhurst and Lawrence and Woodmere, who commuted into Manhattan in the 1910s, working in the garment center, working, in the jewelry district, and even working on Wall Street.
Now, just in terms of the process of, was your second book easier, or anything about putting together all the pieces and what choices you had to make in terms of the chapters and the illustrations and things like that? How was it easier the second time around?
It's a good question. The first book was about all the synagogues on Long Island. And so I spent a tremendous amount of time visiting each synagogue to take a photograph either on the outside or on the inside. And that process for the first book took 4 years to complete, from 2015 to 2019. And I don't know if we've mentioned it, but the book is called Seeking Sanctuary, 125 Years of Synagogues on Long Island. That was the first book, which involved a lot of photography. The second book, I didn't even really think that I was going to be writing a second book until COVID started, and I was at home, and I started doing some research on early individuals. And that process was much shorter only because of the fact that I didn't have to go anywhere. I did it all from, not all of it, but the majority of the work was done sitting on my couch from after dinner until, 12, 1 o'clock in the morning, every single night, just researching names and people and places. And the conclusion, or the final product that has resulted from all that research that I've done in, seeking out census records and, all kinds of other newspaper articles and whatnot, I have been able to identify 4,400 individuals by name who were Jewish and who lived on Long Island in this period between 1705 and 1918. And I think that's something that would be very surprising to people, that there were actually over 4,000 Jews that lived on Long Island before the end of World War I. And in order to make the book completely comprehensive, at the end of each chapter, the individuals who lived in those towns are listed. So there are 16 chapters, all geographic based, starting, with Cedarhurst and then Freeport and, all those in Nassau County, and then also in Suffolk County. And at the end of each chapter, there's a table with the name, birth date, or birth year, as well as any other pertinent information about that individual. If they were instrumental in starting a synagogue, if they had a particular occupation, any little piece of information that I could add, I thought was going to be really important. And, I think it makes it as comprehensive as I could have done.
And what's great is, and if you haven't found it already, I'm sure as people start reading the book, you'll get a wave, hopefully, of more information coming out just from people seeing the book and saying, hey, I've got something in the attic, or let me tell you this story. So the success can build on itself.
It's funny that you mentioned that. I gave a presentation just yesterday. I gave a presentation at the Northport Historical Society. And 2 people came up to me afterwards and asked if I knew their family. And I opened up the book and I showed them the pictures of their family. And one woman, it was her grandfather that was in the book. And another woman, it was her great-grandparents who moved to Mineola and started the synagogue there. And so you're absolutely right. This is not the end of the road for me. And I think that's a great thing for the Jewish Historical Society of Long Island, is that as these pieces of information continue to come out, I can do something with it in a creative way and make it available to the public through the Jewish Historical Society.
And I guess it also speaks to a lot of these families stayed on Long Island, obviously. If their descendants are here to read about them, that's a good sign, too.
That's right. And that was also a really critical piece for me to be able to fill in some holes that I wasn't able to answer only through research online and in newspapers and whatnot. There are descendants, third, fourth, fifth generations of people that still live on Long Island. There's one family that I found in Huntington, 7 generations of Jewish family living in Huntington from the late 1800s to today. 7 generations. I thought that was amazing.
You mentioned vaudeville, and I know in the city, the Yiddish theater was a big thing. And even if we talk about like the Jewish press, Jewish newspapers, was that replicated on the island? Do you know, like, were there specifically Yiddish theaters on the island or specifically Jewish newspapers?
Not that I know of. I don't believe there were any Yiddish language newspapers on Long Island. There was a theatrical group called Lights, and Lights, Lights, was an abbreviation for Long Island. I can't remember.
Okay.
But it was a theater group of people who lived in Freeport. So I mentioned earlier Eva Puck. There were others that came out. Sophie Tucker was a singer of renown during that period. And they would come out, and Freeport was sort of like a summer retreat for them. So there were groups, but they were definitely New York City based.
Yeah, but I guess you could always say we're in some ways tied to this. You know, there's always going to be, it's like the gravitational pull of the city of Manhattan is always going to show itself.
Exactly right. And I think that's part of the reason why the Jewish community of Long Island as a whole does not get its due in terms of its importance in the landscape of the American Jewish community. I can tell you that Long Island is the 4th largest Jewish community today. There are over 300,000 Jews that live on Long Island.
I was going to ask you that because you mentioned that on the last episode. Does that still hold true? Are we still number 4? I
did, yeah. I didn't realize that I mentioned that, but yes, that has not changed significantly in the last 2 years. But as you mentioned, Long Island is an outgrowth of New York City, and that's absolutely true. And so, I think because of that fact, people have kind of pushed Long Island aside a little bit for its importance in American Jewish history, and hopefully now that will change.
So what's your third book going to be on?
I could say with a lot of confidence, I don't think there'll be a third book, but I said that after the first
Exactly,
book,
yeah,
right. Listen, I think establishing the Jewish Historical Society of Long Island will give my, creative outlet a lot of attention. I couldn't imagine that there would be another topic for me to cover in a comprehensive way, the way I have the first 2 books. And I'm fine with that. And there were still a lot of stories to be told and a lot of information to be shared. And people have a thirst for this. I can very proudly say that in the first 6 months of the Jewish Historical Society of Long Island, we have over 1,000 people who have registered their email in our database. We have almost 800 people who have joined the Long Island Jewish History page on Facebook. So, there is a thirst for this, and people just want to interact and understand and learn that information that hasn't been discussed and hasn't been brought to light for many, many years.
So if we're saying we'll post this, it should be, as I'm speaking, it should be the first week of March or so. What's coming up in the next, anything we can point people to in the next month or so, or where can they track your motion, your movements?
I have booked a number of speaking engagements throughout Long Island, and they are all listed on my website. That can be found at bit.ly/synagogues of Long Island. There is a calendar on that website that will list all upcoming speaking engagements in the month of March and April, and I already have 2 booked in May, and moving forward from there, it'll be updated accordingly.
Great. Well, Brad, again, congratulations on all your projects underway, and good luck with the launch, and thanks for talking with us tonight.
Thanks, Chris. I really appreciate you having me on again, and it was great talking to you.
And I want to thank Brad again. We were speaking over Zencaster, talking about his new book, The Jews of Long Island, out now from SUNY Press. You can find links to his website and his book and a lot of related resources in our show notes at longislandhistoryproject.org. Hope you enjoyed this episode, and if you did, all we ask is that you share it with a friend, pass it along, drop it casually into conversation, mention it to the people walking the boardwalk in Sunken Meadow Park. Let them know that there is a podcast out there dedicated to Long Island history. Our outro music was Capering by the Blue Dot Sessions, used under an Attribution 4.0 international license. In just 2 weeks, you will hear a special story for Women's History Month, a personal story, a family story, a story about some very special women.
She was definitely the person behind the scenes doing everything. She was writing, she was publishing, she was smiling and dialing, come to this event, go to that parade, etc. And the organizing in Long Island was extensive, and it went on for a very long time and involved many different types of people. So it's a really good place to start.
That's next time, but for now, thanks for listening.